Preliminary discussion, The Enlightenment by Ritchie Robertson. This is the first of, I guess, a couple of discussions. This is a massive tome, very, very comprehensive, amazing book about a time between sort of 1650 and 1800 in Europe, a period that is called the Enlightenment. It goes through the political, social, economic aspects, philosophical aspects, artistic, pretty much everything. It really covers the subtleties and the big picture message that the Enlightenment sent to Europe and the rest of the world. I think, look, it's not a novel, it's not War and Peace or something like that. So this is I would say, a historic book with written in a very direct way. Lots of quotes, lots of examples, and what I really like a lot, it focuses on, it's a human-centric book. So it starts with, okay, what is the human aspect of this? And this is already the first takeaway. The first takeaway is that the Enlightenment is an attempt to change the hierarchy of decision making. In other words, who decides what is and what isn't? This is the progress of humanity in a nutshell. And what's important, in particular during the Enlightenment, is that this decision was moved towards the human. Now, the human himself is being studied thoroughly, because even if you decide, okay, it's about the human, right? Well, how does the human make decisions? Reason, emotion, sensibility. These are all subjects that are very, very deep in Robertson's book, because this is a corollary of if you delegate decision making to the human, to the human, not the human king or the clergy, but just the human as a species, then you have to ask yourself, okay, how do humans make decisions? And we're still struggling with that question. I think I have a broader view on this. This even ties into today's conversation about AI. I'm going to try to discuss this. Again, this is a very massive tome, so I have to be very careful and strategic about how I discuss this book. I'm going to do preliminary discussions, and then once the book is finished, I'm going to do probably at least 2, if not 3, follow-up discussions to try to wrap the book up. So again, the situation is something in the 1650s, and then we start evolving into a new area of European political, economic, and philosophical and artistic history. That's the Enlightenment. I'm going to discuss one aspect in this preliminary discussion, which is the decision to delegate decision-making away from authority towards the human. This is an Uneven Wrong podcast. It's July 28, 2023. This is Crintelco. For the day, the fund is up 9.1%. The market's up 1.5%. For the year, we are up 130%. The market is up 20.2%. We're outperforming by 109.8%. The market is still open. Things could change. Let's jump right into the conversation here. So, Ritchie Robertson, The Enlightenment. It's a massive tome, and it talks about the attempt by European people starting in the sort of mid-1700s to delegate authority away from the clergy, the political powers like the kings and those sort of things, towards a more broader, more democratic way. We have Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations, as one of the pivotal books that talks about the marketplace in economics, but you can extrapolate this to the marketplace of everything. It's who decides what is and what isn't. In my interview with Silvio Micali about Algorand, I think this was the biggest takeaway from that interview, when Silvio said that crypto has the power to decide what is and what isn't, which is the biggest power in the world. And I second that. And the Enlightenment is an attempt to take that power away from authority towards a more broader, more democratic body of decision makers. It happens across the board. It happens in science. That's the beginning of the scientific method. The scientific method is nothing but a process of trying to decide what is and what isn't based on certain tools and processes that are not, it's not like the clergy or the university professor, whoever decides what is and what isn't. It's a more democratic process. Art, same thing in art. In the arts, you have an evolution of novels that are focusing on the human, die Leiden des jungen Werther, by Goethe, for example. Voltaire talks a lot about the emotions and the intrinsic needs and desires of people. There's a big debate about reason, and this is sort of the second step. So once we decide to democratize decision-making towards the human, well, then we have to understand, well, how does the human make decisions? The human is rational, and there's a lot of talk about reason. Sometimes the Enlightenment is called the age of reason, which actually Robertson disagrees with. Reason, in fact, it's not the age of reason. If you really want to boil down the Enlightenment, it's the age of sensibility. And that makes a lot of sense. You know, this goes even further towards Jonathan Haidt and the righteous mind. I mean, we make decisions based on our emotions a lot more than based on reason. Reason is part of the tool set, and it helps us build the Golden Gate Bridge. It helps us write a program. It helps us prevent death when we ski down a slope and things along those lines. But there's a lot more to decision making, you know, particularly the big decisions in life. For example, voting for presidents, choosing mates, deciding what's good for a child and what's not good. Like a lot of things, we follow the gut, and the gut is just another word for sensibility, because we have a lot more decision making capabilities within our nervous system than just the brain. That's probably as straightforward as I can put it. So again, in this preliminary discussion, I want to talk about this process of delegating decision-making towards a broader set of decision makers. This is really what the Enlightenment is. And I would say it's more than that. I think it's the sort of the idea of how progress actually happens, or what we call progress, what we call the evolution of humankind, of a society. What is a sophisticated society? If I travel around the world, right, and I go to a place that is free and open and has more broader decision-making mechanisms, more complex decision-making mechanisms, then I feel like that is an advanced place. And vice versa, if I go to a place that isn't like that, it's the opposite. This is, for example, very prevalent in places like Korea or Singapore, where you have economic development, no question about that, but the decision-making is still very authoritative. Actually, lots of East Asia is like that. And therefore, you still feel like it's parochial, it's not really developed. And then you can go to a place like, maybe even a place like, well, I guess the other side is a little bit more difficult to find. Let's say in the United States, you have poor states, Alabama and places like that. But still a very sophisticated, broad, democratic way of making decisions. So you still feel like it's more advanced. Like I would say this is the main reason why I feel my gut tells me that the US is more advanced than, let's say, any other place in the world. It's not that people are smarter here, or even the economic standard often is lower than in Europe, but it's just that we have this broader way of decision making. We have a lot more checks and balances. And I think this ties also into the conversation I had yesterday about David Deutsch and the conversation that I followed with Deutsch and Bennett, Charlie Bennett, excuse me, about mathematics and things like that. Because what Deutsch says, it's just a continuation of the Enlightenment. Deutsch says that it's bit from it, so that physics is the ultimate decision-making power. In other words, nature and its way of working tells us what is and what isn't. And we humans create the laws of physics, which is a language that helps us understand nature. And with those laws of physics, we do all the other things, mathematics, rational thinking, and all of those kinds of things. It's also interesting to take this to the next level, in a sense that we could then, this is also a podcast just recently, I made an episode about what's going on in the knowledge lab in the University of Chicago. They said that we could actually progress science a lot more if we had an AI which can make decisions separate from human biases, sociological, political, psychological biases. So I don't want to jump too far, and I just want to set a few points, sort of set the stage for further discussions about Robertson's book. Right? Again, it's a subtle move away from authority towards a broader set of decision makers. Those decision makers, they themselves grow from the religious wars in Europe. So there's a precedent to the Enlightenment, which is the religious wars in Europe, where authority has been taken away from the church. This is the fundamental development. So authority is taken away from the church. Actually, Henry VIII starts this process in the English-speaking world, and of course Luther in the German-speaking world. And you have this necessity to broaden the decision-making process. Simply, once you decide that you're not tied up with the Catholic Church anymore, you have to find new ways. And then we have this evolution of Parliament. And once we break that dam, okay, it's a small step then towards, let's say, the scientific method, where we say, well, if we make political decisions based on, let's say, a certain body of people who are elected or not elected, doesn't matter, but we just take away decision-making power from one absolute dictator towards more people. Well, it's a small step to make that same, let's say, in science, where we say, well, who gets to decide what is and what isn't? Just because you have tenure, or actually in those days, just because you're a clergy that is, I don't know, for some reason sitting in a monastery and doing research, it doesn't mean that you have the decision-making power. And again, it's all about research. Why does the concept of research come up? Well, if you want to understand the world, if you want to understand, if you take away the belief that we are driven by God and the divine, then you start looking elsewhere, and you start looking naturally towards nature, because that is what is. If you walk into a wall, you don't have the choice to believe that that wall doesn't exist. It's going to hurt. So there is actually an ultimate arbiter. This is what David Deutsch says, and that's physics, nature. And we are going to believe in that. So that's, the beginning of the Enlightenment with Galileo and the research and the empirical research, which, according to David Deutsch, for example, is actually wrong, but understandable. So what is and what isn't is decided by our senses. Deutsch says that's not quite true, because our senses are guided by theory. And by the way, this is for another episode, but I think there is a bit of an oxymoron with Deutsch, who says that the laws of physics decide what is and what isn't, therefore it's bit from it. But then the laws of physics are actually a construct by humans. So then it is actually humans, and it's, it from bit. So it's a little bit confusing there, but I don't want to discuss this here. This is for another podcast. Let's get back to the conversation. The Enlightenment, again, the summary of this preliminary discussion is that we have a move towards a more democratic way of decision-making across the board. We have a more human-centric way of decision-making, so away from abstract concepts such as kings and clergy towards humans, and then we have to understand what humans are. That's why literature is focused a lot on sensibilities, on humans, on thought, on feelings, on emotions, because no matter what, no matter how you slices and dice it, rationality is only part of the equation. Rationality is important, and it's definitely helpful, but it's only a small part of the decision-making process. The big decisions are made by sensibility, by emotions, and that is, again, in the first part of the book, that comes across in examples, particularly when Robertson talks about literature. He points out Goethe's Die Leidensübung Werther, one of the seminal pieces of the Enlightenment. There's a lot more. I mean, I grew up in the German-speaking world, so I'm familiar with that. It's about emotions, it's about feelings, because those are the ultimate drivers of decision-making. Thank you.